This is The World This Weekend. Hello, I'm Stephanie Skandaris. Coming up, the World Health Organization warns Gaza's healthcare system is collapsing.
The impact of the conflict on health is catastrophic. Nowhere and no one is safe in Gaza.
Also on the program,
I want everyone to act to find the common ground we as COP28 presidency have asked for.
at COP28, negotiators remain divided on the future of oil, gas, and coal. And it's getting harder for some Canadians to pick up their holiday parcels.
You need to drive 2 hours to get to a city from here, and that's where the next post office is.
We'll tell you why some small-town post offices are disappearing. That's later. But first, we begin tonight in the Middle East, where Israeli forces continue to push deeper into southern Gaza, the military telling Palestinians in the city of Khan Yunis to evacuate. As the fighting intensifies, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is once again urging Israel to protect civilians.
We think there needs to be a premium put on protecting civilians and making sure that humanitarian assistance can get to everyone who needs it. And as I said, I think the intent is there, but the results are not always manifesting themselves.
As our correspondent Margaret Evans tells us, the health and humanitarian systems in Gaza continue to crumble.
No end in sight to Gaza's pain, burying itself ever deeper into the hearts of those who suffer it. In Khan Yunis, the morgue at Al Nasser Hospital is overwhelmed, and the grieving now say their farewells hunched over bodies lined up on the ground in white shrouds, some pulling back the cloth for one last look at a beloved face, and then group prayers for group burials. Israeli ground forces have been moving closer to the center of Khan Yunis in southern Gaza, warning Palestinians living nearby to move for their own safety, prompting yet another exodus of uncertainty. We fled because of the bombing, says Mohammed Sayyam. We're heading to Rafah, hoping it will be safe, but I doubt it. We're not affiliated with Hamas, Fatah, or Islamic Jihad, says this father, also heading for Rafah with a blind daughter. In Rafah, sanctuary is but an idea for those charged with civil defense, the ambulance and emergency workers called out after airstrikes. The hardest part is when you see a kid under the rubble or a child in pieces, says Haitham Al-Hams, a deputy director who's worked in civil defense for 15 years. You see women and children without weapons, he says. No fault in the conflict except that they exist on this land. The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has renewed his call for an immediate ceasefire, despite Washington's veto of a resolution to that effect at the Security Council on Friday. But Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says a ceasefire isn't compatible with Israel's goal of destroying Hamas. And today he thanked the United States for sending ammunition. Ammunition important to the continuation of the war, he says. I thank President Biden for the United States' firm and just stance. In Qatar, at the Doha Forum, the Jordanian Foreign Minister Ayman Safadi said he'd had a very blunt conversation with the U.S. Secretary of State.
Our priorities are set. Stop the aggression, allow sufficient humanitarian supplies into all parts of Gaza, ensure protection of civilians.
The World Health Organization has called the impact of the war in Gaza as catastrophic. There were desperate scenes in Rafah today. People ran after aid trucks after they'd crossed into Gaza from Egypt, trying to climb on board and pull off what supplies they could. Margaret Evans, CBC News, Jerusalem.
The president of COP28 says the climate summit is nearing its end game. And he's right. Time is running out for nations at the Dubai talks to find common ground on the future of fossil fuels. And world leaders say despite their differences, everyone needs a say to avoid a global climate catastrophe. Kyle Bax explains why.
There is no end in sight.
No matter which way you turn at COP28, there's a good chance you'll see demonstrators pushing for climate action, which often means taking aim at big oil. The sector is a major contributor to climate change. Almost 30% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions come from oil and gas. And yet thousands of representatives made the trip to Dubai to be part of the climate summit.
Being an oil and gas executive here is interesting.
Rona Del Freri is with Cenovus Energy, a Calgary-based oil and gas producer. She isn't part of climate negotiations, but instead here to share ideas and collaborate.
Once they hear that we're really truthful and honest and truly committed to addressing our emissions, I think that it really opens up their minds.
The summit is in the home stretch, with nations debating whether to agree on an ultimate phasing out of fossil fuels by 2050. COP28 President Sultan Ahmed Al Jaber urged nations to come to make progress.
I want everyone to show flexibility, to act with urgency, and to find the common ground we as COP28 presidency have asked for.
The International Energy Agency released a report Sunday saying pledges made so far at the summit, such as tripling nuclear energy and curbing methane emissions, will make a difference, but only by a third of what is needed to reduce greenhouse gases by 2030.
Clean up your mess. Our people are in distress.
Environmental activists have unleashed a fire hose of criticism toward the oil patch. At the same time, conference organizers are welcoming to big oil. They say to tackle climate change, it will take all hands on deck, even major polluters.
So we are committed to take that urgent action to address our greenhouse gas emissions as aggressively as we possibly can.
Kendall Dilling is president of the Pathways Alliance, representing the major Canadian oil sands players.
If we could have started that 10 years ago, of course it would have given us that much further running room to tackle this very, very important challenge.
Leading UN officials want a total phase out of fossil fuels by 2050. Some countries want that explicitly written in any agreement to come out of these talks. But countries like Saudi Arabia are resisting, arguing the focus should be on reducing emissions, not targeting what causes them. Kyle Bax, CBC News, Dubai.
Also high on the agenda during talks today in Dubai, water scarcity. Canada is expected to soon tackle that issue here at home. The Federal Indigenous Services Minister could table legislation on improving water quality in First Nations communities as early as tomorrow. There are few details about the bill, but the measure comes a year after the federal government repealed the previous law. Some First Nations leaders had said that legislation was ineffective and even dangerous. Meanwhile, fishermen on India's west coast say they are struggling with smaller catches, larger and stronger storms, and more volatile waters. Climate change, they say, is threatening a way of life they have maintained for generations. Salima Shivji reports from Mumbai.
In the early hours of the morning along India's west coast, the rickety fishing boats are pulling up to the dock one by one, while those on shore wait anxiously to see what's in today's catch. The baskets deposited from the boats onto the dock seem plentiful, bags full of fish that Mumbai's traditional Koli community of fishermen desperately need to make a living. But as the families who've been fishing these waters for generations get down to work sorting through the fish and evaluating the haul, Prima Baliram Kohli is filled with disappointment. Only 14 crates, she says, when a good day brings 50. Sometimes we get next to nothing. Fishing here has changed so much as the sea has changed, the 50-year-old says, and our expenses are very high. Their small boats now have to venture into deeper waters far from shore, and still their nets don't drag in what they used to. The fish are disappearing, their ecosystems disrupted, experts say, because of drastically warming temperatures. The Arabian Sea is part of the Indian Ocean, which climate scientists confirm is warming faster than any other. That means more powerful cyclones are much more frequent.
And Arabian Sea was very calm and quiet in the past.
No longer, says Medha Deshpande, a scientist at the Pune-based Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology. She studied severe weather patterns in the Arabian Sea over the last 40 years and found a major difference in the last 2 decades.
It's about 52% increase in the number of cyclones compared to past 20 and recent 20 years. So 52% is remarkable.
The cyclones now last 80% longer and intense storms have tripled, her research found. Dinesh Kohli and his wife Rajeshwari know how their sea is changing. They're still haunted by the memory of the last major cyclone 2 years ago. There was nothing left of our 2 boats. We lost everything, Rajeshwari says. I couldn't bear to see it. She prays that a devastating storm like this one won't hit again. But climate experts say it will. It's the new normal. And it's not just warming temperatures that are threatening the livelihoods of fishermen. There's also construction of Mumbai's billion-dollar coastal road that's meant to ease the city's crippling traffic. It's squeezed local fishing villages and warped fish habitats, fisherman Sanjay Biker says. The government's priority is cars and parking. Why is there no space made for us or our boats, he asks. At the local market where the small-scale fishmongers are trying to sell their catch, there's deep worry. With their land shrinking, fish disappearing, and the strain of bartering for a good price, many have given up, leaving their traditional jobs passed down the family line behind, says Santosh Kohli, a fisherman and local activist.
So many people of fishermen are going to the towers and buildings for security guard working for their livelihood, other work.
He says many of their fishing boats now sit anchored for days with erratic weather patterns hard to predict. And the specter of more losses hangs heavy here. The fishing community, so dependent on rapidly warming waters, struggling with an uncertain future. Salima Shivji, CBC News, Mumbai.
To Cairo. Egyptians crowd around a polling station to vote in the presidential election. Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is widely expected to win a 3rd term in power, despite Egypt's economic crisis and a war on its border with Gaza. Critics say al-Sisi has silenced dissent. As army chief 10 years ago, he led the overthrow of the democratically elected Muslim Brotherhood government and won his first term as president the following year. Voting will be spread over 3 days, with results due to be announced December 18th. Today marks 75 years since the UN passed a landmark pledge to protect the freedoms of all humans. It's meant to be a right. In many places, however, it's anything but. For decades, activist Narges Mohammadi has fought the oppression of women by Iran's regime. She was honored for it today with the Nobel Peace Prize at a ceremony she was forced to miss because of a lack of freedom. Philip Lee Shannock explains.
At the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony in Oslo, Norway, an empty chair waits for Narges Mohammadi, placed before a smiling portrait of the jailed Iranian human rights activist.
She continues her activism from behind the walls.
Berit Reiss-Anderson presents the award to her 2 teenage children, Ali and Kiana Rahmani, on her behalf.
Woman, life, freedom.
Zan, zendegi, azadi.
The renowned Iranian activist was recognized for 3 decades of fighting for human rights. Mohammadi is now 51. In the 1990s, she led a wave of protests that swept across the country, advocating for women's rights and democracy. Her brother, Hamidreza Mohammadi, says her campaign continues.
She's not here with us today. She's in prison, and she will be on a hunger strike. But we feel her presence here, and I'm sure a lot of Iranian people feel her presence in their hearts.
Toronto area activist Lily Perzand, whose parents were held in the same prison, says winning the prize sends a powerful message to the regime.
Receiving the award by Narges Mohammadi behind Evin prison's walls, it's so meaningful. Metaphorically, to me, those walls today collapsed.
Perzand says Mohammadi's fight has inspired a new generation, including those who have taken to the streets protesting last year's death in custody of Mahsa Amini. The 22-year-old Kurdish woman was held by Iran's morality police, allegedly for not wearing her headscarf properly.
And the empowering message that globally was given to the Iranian women that we heard you, we are behind you.
Iran's regime pretends that it doesn't care about the outside world and the opinion of the outside world, but it's actually very sensitive.
Keva Sharouz is a Toronto human rights lawyer and senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute.
I think awards like this, like the Nobel Peace Prize, are really significant because they indicate international condemnation of the despicable behavior of Iran's regime.
And he says proof of the regime's sensitivity to criticism is its refusal to allow Mahsa Amini's family from traveling to France this weekend to receive a human rights prize on her behalf. Philip Shannock, CBC News, Toronto.
Quebec is overhauling its healthcare system. A sweeping reform bill was adopted in the early hours of this morning. It looks to centralize how healthcare is delivered with the aim of making it more efficient. But those who deliver the care are preparing to go on strike. So as Sarah Levitt tells us, getting them to support change might be a challenge.
It's been an ever-present sight across Quebec for weeks. Hundreds of thousands of public sector workers outside schools, hospitals, and clinics on strike as contract negotiations with the government stall. On Monday, 80,000 nurses will join those ranks for a 4-day strike.
That is absolutely the last option for nurses. But
sitting at her local coffee shop nursing a latte, Nathalie Steak-Ducet says nurses really feel they have no choice. The nursing teacher and researcher says at stake are salaries and working conditions.
A lot of nurses, before they even start working in the public healthcare system, already have an exit strategy in place, and that is not normal.
As workers strike, Quebec is grappling with an ongoing healthcare crisis. Nearly half of new nurses are leaving the profession before they turn 35. More than 2 million people don't have a family doctor.
Alors la motion est adoptée.
In Quebec City, the government says it has the solution. A sweeping health reform bill adopted this weekend after debate on the topic was shut down. With it comes the creation of a new oversight state-owned agency called Santé Québec. It'll be responsible for most of the decision-making in the healthcare system. The province says the reform will allow patients to seek care outside of their postal code area and make it easier to access a specialist.
We have done a lot of work.
Health Minister Christian Dubé says it will be good for employees, too.
We have more mobility with our employees because they are not linked to one establishment.
But he says unions have to recognize the benefits of the reform and help along the way.
It's not only a matter of additional dollars or additional remuneration. We need to have flexibility in those collective agreements so that we can improve.
The unions disagree. Jessica Goldschlager is with a union representing healthcare technicians.
There's absolutely no consensus around this bill.
Her union is part of the Common Front, a group of unions representing teachers and healthcare workers, which are in the middle of a 7-day strike.
It was improvised. It's a very quick bill that is completely going to destabilize the healthcare system.
The nurses' union has presented a counteroffer to the government. If rejected, reform or not, nurses will be on the picket line tomorrow. Sarah Levitt, CBC News, Montreal.
The president of an elite American university has resigned following a hearing on Capitol Hill this week, and calls are getting louder for the leaders of Harvard and MIT to do the same. The three presidents are facing widespread backlash for evading questions about anti-Semitism on campus. As Katie Simpson reports from Washington, the hearing has sparked an intense debate about how to stop hate in higher education.
This is a huge win for Jewish students all across the country.
There is a sense of relief among many Jewish students at the University of Pennsylvania now that the school's president has resigned. The comments Liz McGill made during her congressional testimony this past week were indefensible, according to Joe Hochberg, the vice president of the UPenn Jewish Heritage Program.
That was the nail in the coffin. To hear the president of a university that I attend say that she can't flatly condemn calls for Jewish genocide was disgusting and honestly a little scary.
McGill had been facing intense pressure to step down from a variety of powerful places, including from donors, who were threatening to pull as much as $100 million in funding. Fury stemming from a congressional hearing examining anti-Semitism on university campuses, where McGill was grilled alongside the presidents of Harvard and MIT.
Does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Penn's rules or code of conduct?
Republican Congresswoman Elise Stefanik put this line of questioning to all three leaders, with McGill and her peers all delivering similar answers.
If the speech turns into conduct, it can be harassment. Yes, it is a context-dependent decision, Congresswoman.
It's a context-dependent decision. That's your testimony today. Calling for the genocide of Jews is depending upon the context.
The testimony was broadly condemned and even mocked during the opening sketch of Saturday Night Live.
Do you think genocide is bad?
Could I submit an answer in writing at a later date?
And it drew criticism from Vice President Kamala Harris's husband, Doug Emhoff, a rare political statement from the second gentleman.
We've seen the presidents of some of our most elite universities literally unable to denounce calling for the genocide of Jews as anti-Semitic. That lack of moral clarity is simply unacceptable.
McGill later clarified her comments, describing calls for Jewish genocide as evil, but that she was trying to balance free speech rights in her responses.
I was focused on our university's longstanding policies aligned with the U.S. Constitution, which say that speech alone is not punishable.
Pressure is mounting for the presidents of Harvard and MIT to follow McGill's lead. Reports of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia have been surging across the U.S. since the October 7th attacks, with institutions, especially colleges, struggling to deal with hate and free speech. Katie Simpson, CBC News, Washington.
In Germany, support for the State of Israel is seen as a national responsibility, a form of atonement for the crimes of the Holocaust. Germany is struggling to clamp down on a sudden rise in anti-Semitic crimes. At the same time, some say Germany's unwavering support of Israel is silencing anyone who openly supports Palestinians. Melissa Kent reports from Berlin.
Outside a synagogue in central Berlin, about 24 people gather nearby to protect those entering the house of worship. Barbara Janssen has been coming every Friday night for weeks.
So it started the day after the Molotov cocktails assault.
Police are still looking for the two men who threw the firebombs, which landed on the sidewalk. It's one of more than 600 anti-Semitic crimes that have happened in Germany since the October 7th attacks by Hamas, according to federal police.
We do not tolerate anti-Semitism. Nowhere.
German Chancellor Olaf Scholz.
It is about keeping the promise that was made again and again in the decades after 1945. The promise, never again.
But critics say this historical guilt is creating a climate of anxiety among those who want to voice support for Palestinians. Authorities in several cities have clamped down on pro-Palestinian rallies, citing fears including incitement to violence and anti-Semitic acts. Wafa Mustafa is a well-known Syrian activist who now lives in Berlin. She says she's learned there are limits to freedom of expression in Germany.
I spent years here being praised and applauded for Syria, Iran, Afghanistan, and Ukraine, and then suddenly you say free Palestine. Oh, look at this terrorist.
Amir Ali is with the activist group Palestine Speaks. Last month, 5 police officers turned up at his door with a search warrant for his electronic devices because of a comment posted on his group's Instagram page by someone else. The warrant says the post condones war crimes committed by Hamas.
They went through toiletries, they went through drawers with underwear, even went into the washing machine.
Ali says the incident left him and his partner shaken.
In my opinion, we've been very good citizens of Germany. We've never done anything unlawful.
A few years ago, Germany expanded its definition of anti-Semitism. As well as hatred toward Jews, it now includes attacks on Israel. Some argue it's being used to target legitimate dissent.
Because the idea of anti-Semitism is so vague, it's like what constitutes, right? So it becomes terrifying.
Deborah Feldman moved to Berlin after fleeing her ultra-Orthodox Jewish community in Brooklyn. Her memoir was the basis for the Netflix series Unorthodox.
But I left without telling anyone.
The author is among more than 100 Jewish artists, writers, and scholars who signed an open letter condemning Germany's crackdown on demonstrations. It states, if this is an attempt to atone for history, its effect is to risk repeating it.
And I feel so connected to German society in many ways, but The way that the politics functions here, there's no sense of any real healthy discourse.
Feldman says for the first time since moving to Germany, she's debating leaving.
I came here to cross barriers and break down walls. That was what Berlin always represented. And I don't know if these walls are coming down.
Melissa Kent for CBC News, Berlin.
You're listening to The World This Weekend on CBC Radio. I'm Stephanie Skandaris. You can listen to this program anytime on the CBC Listen app or on the CBC News YouTube channel. The post office is at the heart of many small Canadian towns. It's where people meet, do business, even pick up medications. But over the past decades, and in the face of mounting financial losses, hundreds of post offices have had to close. Yvette Bren tells us what that means for communities.
Atlan is a tiny 500-person town at the very northern edge of BC, near the Alaska and Yukon borders. There's no cell service and only one road.
Atlan is at the end of a 100-kilometer road that doesn't go anywhere else. We need to drive 2 hours to get to a city, and that's where the next post office is.
People like Fiona Harrigan rely on the post office for mail, connection, even medication. When it burned down last year, a temporary post office was opened in an old morgue where mail was sorted manually. In all the upheaval, mail was delayed. Shani Babcock missed a longtime friend's wedding. The invitation took 5 months to arrive.
Our mail service is extremely terrible. It's a Canada Post issue, and unfortunately it can be pretty frustrating.
She says postmasters aren't paid enough, and leases and renovations to meet Canada Post standards are expensive. Since the 90s, hundreds of rural post offices have been shut down across Canada. Taylor Backrack is the NDP MP for Skeena-Bulkley Valley and represents Atlan.
It's a huge issue for rural Canada. Right across this country, we're seeing small post offices close down. What we're seeing is a loss of a really vital federal service in communities where people depend on the post office.
In the past year, post offices in Atlan, Telegraph Creek, BC, Langdon, Alberta, Windsor and Maberly, Ontario, Brooklyn, Nova Scotia, and Bell River, PEI have closed or risk closing.
247.
All this as Canada Post has been under intense financial pressure as less people send parcels, reporting $290 million in losses in the third quarter of 2023. Canada Post says it's a challenge to keep post offices open when postmasters leave or affordable leases expire. Atlan's post office was saved thanks to Stephen Lancaster. He opened the town's new post office this month inside Atlan Mountain Inn.
You just have to have a place where you can go and get your mail, get your medications, even socialize for a little bit. Every community needs a place where they can go to get their business done.
Hopeful, he's installed more postal boxes than there are people who live in Atlan. Fiona Harrigan hopes it's here for good.
I really hope that Canada Post will find a way to keep the post office alive everywhere.
A hope shared in many small towns across Canada. Yvette Brend, CBC News, Vancouver.
If you're blue and you don't know where to go to, why don't you go where fashion sits? Putting on the Ritz.
A great big mystery has been unfolding over the past couple of days at the most expensive hotel in Paris, the Ritz. And it involves a great big diamond ring worth well over $1 million Canadian dollars. According to a French newspaper, a guest at the hotel identified only as a Malaysian businesswoman left the sparkler on the bedstand while she went shopping. When she returned, it was missing. She reported the loss to police on Friday. They launched an investigation, and the hotel had to answer a lot of questions because it's not the first time fancy jewelry has gone missing from the glitzy Ritz. Back in 2018, there was this story.
Armed thieves broke into a jewellery shop at the luxury Ritz Hotel in Paris and stole goods with an estimated value of €4.5 million.
Later that same year, a Saudi royal family member said more than $1.1 million worth of jewelry had been taken from the hotel. This time, though, our story has a happier ending. Today, security found the businesswoman's ring. Where? The bottom of the bag of a vacuum cleaner. So maybe a little dusty, but surely as sparkly as ever.
Diamonds are forever.
We'll leave you with a little more of Shirley Bassey's classic, Diamonds Are Forever. And a reminder that hotel rooms usually have safes. This has been The World This Weekend. I'm Stephanie Skandaris. Thanks for listening.